Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Look around this room. Think about the last time you heard the word colonialism. I guarantee it wasn't a compliment. For the last century, this word has been the ultimate political, historical, and moral poison. To accuse an idea, a policy, or an opponent of being colonial is to instantly condemn it. This is a global, settled consensus. But what if this consensus is wrong? What if the universal condemnation of colonialism, this foundational idea of modern international affairs, has actually been a disaster for hundreds of millions of people? That is the radical, explosive, and frankly, offensive premise of the text we're reanalyzing today. Bruce Gilley's The Case for Colonialism. The central purpose of Gilley's argument is to challenge the moral and intellectual framework that has governed us since the end of World War II. He wants us to rethink the notion that colonialism is always and everywhere a bad thing because he claims the anti-colonial regimes that replaced it have led to a grave human toll. He is calling for nothing less than a global shift. It is time to make the case for colonialism again. Gilley builds his case by attempting to dismantle the intellectual legitimacy of anti-colonial thought. He says the critique failed in three distinct ways: objectively, subjectively, and intellectually. The first defense involves confronting the historical record head-on. Critics say colonialism was objectively harmful. Gilley argues that it often resulted in net benefits when measured against the likely alternative or counterfactual. The counterfactual trap. Anti-colonial scholarship often fails because it measures colonial rule against perfection, not against what would have happened otherwise, for example, indigenous political chaos, violence, or stagnation. He argues that many non-colonized countries like Ethiopia, Haiti, or Liberia did not fare better than their colonized neighbors. The undeniable gains. Gilley insists the record shows objective improvements: expanded education, improved public health, the creation of basic infrastructure, and crucially, the abolition of slave trading, which he calls an undoubtedly a benefit of colonialism. The intellectual contradiction. He highlights the logical gymnastics of critics who argue that colonialism was both too disruptive, for example, changing borders, and not disruptive enough, for example, failing to eradicate tribalism at the same time. This is, in his view, the sign of a poor argument. The second defense tackles the moral high ground, the claim that colonialism was an illegitimate imposition. Gilley argues that it was often highly legitimate because it provided better governance than the local indigenous alternatives. Evidence of acceptance. How did millions of people show their support? Through voluntary acts. They sent their children to colonial schools. They migrated towards areas of more intense colonial rule. They fought in colonial armies, and they collaborated. He cites a British governor of the Gold Coast, noting that had the people wished to push them into the sea, there was little to prevent them. The implication for Gilley. The rapid expansion of empires with very little force is prima facie proof that the preservers, facilitators, and collaborators outnumbered the resistors until very late. This is the key to his entire argument. Claims anti-colonialism was never meant to be a scientific claim subject to facts. It was born as a political and ideological project aimed at contemporaneous advocacy. Weaponizing history. This ideological purity is damaging because it weaponizes the colonial past, turning history into a tool for present-day social movements, rather than a source of truth and learning. Now, Gilley delivers his core punch: the disastrous consequences of the anti-colonial consensus, using a powerful case study. The nation of Guinea-Bissau, led by the anti-colonial hero Amilcar Cabral, serves as his prime example of the costs of independence. Before and after, Gilley details how Portuguese rule had quadrupled rice production and increased life expectancy. Cabral's subsequent liberation war was fought with the goal to totally destroy all aspects of the colonial state. The result: the state became a cesspool of human suffering. Rice production collapsed to one-third of the colonial peak. The health transition stalled, and the country was plunged into political chaos, requiring a permanent UN peacekeeping force. The global picture. Gilley says this is not an outlier. He cites a World Bank report noting that almost every African country has witnessed a systematic regression of capacity in the last 30 years, meaning most had better capacity at independence than they possess now. Conclusion: he argues that the loss of state capacity caused by anti-colonial regimes is responsible for the loss of tens of millions of lives. The anti-colonial movement, not colonialism, was the greater global threat. Reclaiming the future of the colonial toolkit if anti-colonialism failed. What is the answer? Gilley proposes we reclaim the colonial toolkit through 3 practical ways, all centered on the colonial governance agenda. A. The colonial governance agenda. This agenda replaces the often patronizing good governance model with one that is rooted in real-world success, even if controversial. Replicate the past. Developing countries should explicitly borrow from the successful governance of their colonial pasts, for example, Singapore or Botswana. He notes that even Chinua Achebe, the famed novelist, eventually admitted British colonies were more or less expertly run. Increase foreign involvement. The core idea is that state capacity is lacking and must be bolstered by external actors. He points to Indonesia hiring the Swiss firm SGS to completely rebuild its customs service in the UNATSA. Highly successful colonial-style act of outsourcing sovereignty. B. Recodify. Sharing sovereignty in weak states. Gilley argues, we need formal arrangements that involve a share of sovereignty. Stop the euphemisms. He insists that programs like Ramsay Australia controlling policing in the Solomon Islands or the U.S. World Bank, co-signatory arrangements in Chad should stop hiding behind names like shared sovereignty. They should be called colonialism to reflect the reality of the control needed to get results. Legitimacy by performance. For Gilley, a new colonial relationship is legitimized not by a democratic vote, which is impossible in a corrupt, weak state, but by performance by the intervening state demonstrating it can stop corruption and get the job done. See the most radical idea? Building new colonies from scratch? The most provocative proposal is to create new countries through charter cities or new colonies. Based on the success of Hong Kong, the Galenist proposal, Gilley suggests that the government of Guinea-Bissau could lease the uninhabited island of Galenist back to Portugal for 99 years. The mechanism Portugal would have absolute sovereignty. International aid would be redirected there to build a modern state from a blank slate. The outcome: this new, successful European enclave would become an economic dynamo that the failed mainland state could emulate. Gilley's final justification. This model provides legitimacy. People choose to move their motivation. It's self-financing. And effectiveness. It starts clean. 5. Conclusion. We began with the idea that the word colonialism is unchallengeable. Gilley's entire argument is a rejection of that moral certainty. He believes the modern world has chosen ideological comfort over human welfare. The idea of Galenas may be preposterous, but for him it is far less preposterous than the ideological dogma that has condemned millions to poverty and violence. His case is structured as a moral, historical, and practical syllogism. Premise 1. Anti-colonialism failed objectively and ideologically, leading to decades of humanitarian disaster. Premise 2. Historical colonialism often provided better governance, stability, and human development than the indigenous alternatives. Conclusion. Therefore, to save lives and build effective states, we must reclaim and implement a form of colonialism again. Final question. Do you agree with Gilley that the cost of preserving the anti-colonial narrative has been a greater human toll than the original colonialism itself? Or is his argument an unacceptable revival of Eurocentric imperialism?